Well, July is savings month, and a recent statistics taken from 80/20 found that of the approximately 20 million active credit consumers in the country, only 38% of them have paid their accounts up to date. Today, we take a look at South African savings habits as well as trends within the market, including regulatory changes such as enforced saving. Joining us at the desk for the discussion is Ryan Blumenow. He's economist at KPMG, and Laurence Hillman, who's managing director of One Life as well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. So, the low savings rate in South Africa is a well-publicized phenomenon. If people aren't spending money on gaming, are they saving enough?
I think the short answer to that is a resounding no. It turns out that the savings rate nationally is very low, and particularly hard hit are the youth. They're saving an incredibly small amount, particularly towards their retirement. And so, if you consider that in the context of the general state of over-indebtedness amongst South African consumers and, the nature of the South African consumerist culture, we really aren't saving enough at all.
Laurence, what's the problem though, and what's acting as the deterrent? Because I came across the latest MasterCard survey for consumer purchasing priorities, looking at money management specifically. And what stood out there is that South African consumers are wary of the economic future and are taking precautionary measures, but they're still not saving enough.
The issue is behavioral. In a world of instant gratification, you were talking earlier about some of the instant gratification, delayed gratification is key. And what I mean by that is not spending, but people want to spend immediately, and they're not distinguishing between needs and wants. Now, needs are things like housing, food, etc. Wants are, well, I want the latest pair of jeans, I want the latest gadget, I want the latest game, and they're not distinguishing between those two. What they need to do is distinguish and cut out the stuff that is wants and focus more on their needs.
Sure, but I have a question, and it's something I've tried to understand, because as I sit in my 30s, I've kind of seen both sides. I've seen guys that were 25 years old and were driving around in fancy BMWs, and those have subsequently been put on the back of tow trucks and taken away. Has the behaviour changed in the last 4 years as we've essentially played through this global financial crisis where jobs have been lost, or are we still just repeating the same mistakes time and time again?
I think people do repeat the same mistakes time and time again. That's evident in lapse rates on savings and investment vehicles. It's evident in the statistics that Ryan will chat to you about around household savings. It's evident there. The thing is that people need to change, because otherwise they're going to not be able to survive later on in life. They're not going to be able to retire properly, and we're going to have a bigger, broader economic problem in the economy.
So, Laurence, where do you think we've gone wrong? I mean, why do we not have a culture of saving in this country as compared to others?
I don't want to blame it on advertising, but we've been brought up in an environment that advertisers says that you have to have the latest clothes, you've got to have the latest perfume, and it drives a behavior where people want to aspire to that, rather than focusing on what they need. Cutting out the superfluous, doing simple things like budgeting, and there's some simple techniques around that people could use to improve their financial standing.
Ryan, is this something that now we need to focus on, a behaviour that we need to change by enforcing legislation, enforcing law? Is that the only way we're going to see an evolution here?
It isn't the only way, but it's absolutely something that we need to consider. The problem that Laurence touched upon is definitely behavioral, and if you look at the statistics of savings and consumer expenditure in South Africa, mostly what that points to is a lack of financial knowledge. Consumers and households in general don't really understand the ways in which they're supposed to be saving, what they're saving for, and how to go about the process of saving. And so the regulations and procedures that government is putting in place now is one way to mitigate that problem, but I think that what we need to do is couple that with a marked behavioural and cultural change.
Okay, but who's doing it well? Because you only look at the UK and the argument there, I mean, the UK is no better at saving than we are at the moment, and they've got a far higher level of employment. They do have the subsidies, etc., but they're still not getting it right, and you would argue that they have a superior education.
Yep.
What countries out there are doing it right, and what are they doing well?
That's a difficult question to answer, because the state of saving rests particularly on the state of education and financial knowledge. And there are a number of countries that are doing particularly well at that. It could be argued that the USA is doing fairly well in terms of knowledge of financial products, although I'm not sure many people want to revisit what happened recently there. Australia is doing particularly well in terms of education about finances. But I think what needs to happen is a push from government in terms of instilling a mentality towards saving, and there are some systems in place such as tax-based incentives where you can get a tax break if you are saving towards things like retirement, and they're coupling that with certain mandatory shifts.
How do you start saving, Laurence? Because education is a very big thing and everyone wants tips. I mean, Wonga.com had a social network survey recently run, and one of the outcomes there was that 59% of the respondents said that they needed saving tips, and it shows that people are willing to save, they just don't know how to.
Well, I think just to carry on from what Ryan was talking about, financial literacy is key. There's a social responsibility on all financial institutions to ensure that people are educated and that their people educate and give financial literacy to the people who buy their products. But some tips. I think the easiest thing the way to put this in context is, one is you have to manage your behavior. Two is you have to manage your debt. Then you've got to look at how do you start investing and saving. So let's start off with managing behavior. I mentioned briefly delayed gratification. It is key. So the needs and wants. The next thing to do is to manage your spend. Now, managing your spend it can be as simple as just writing down your budget, your monthly budget. Now, your expenditure, the debit orders and that type of thing is easy to get written down. The issue is the stuff that you spend on daily. The stuff that you wonder where your money went to at the end of the month and wonder why that you have more debt than you have income. So it's to write that down. Then it's to identify what those are and say, well, can I cut those out? So that's to manage your expenditure. Take the family on that journey because they're part of that spending. Also, if you're educating as a parent your children, they're learning the stuff that we never learnt as children. So that's the first part, is managing expenditure. If you've got debt, there's some simple tips and techniques one can do there. Learn. Read, go online, get yourself as financially literate as you possibly can. Change your spending habits, write down your budget, stick to your budget, contact your credit or people who you've got credit with, renegotiate debt with them. Any additional cash, the principle is spend every additional cent you have in reducing your smallest, highest interest rate debt as possible and reduce that. Insurance cover, you need to manage your risk. Your personal income earning is your biggest asset you have in life. So you need to protect that with life cover, disability cover. And then if you do have a really bad debt situation, contact a counsellor and they'll assist you in putting a plan. And most important, persevere.
And don't take a smart little loan from Wonga.com. Ryan, I mean, maybe I want to just bring you back to something. You said Australia, so what they do very well is superannuation.
Yes.
And what's interesting about superannuation is that you actually take a genuine interest in your retirement.
Yeah.
Does something like that, would something like that work in South Africa?
I think it would. If you consider the statistics around why people are not saving, you can see that in South Africa, people are really not considering their retirement at all. As high as 33% of people are still in debt after retiring, and as many as 56% of people are not starting to save even by the age of 30. So if you are putting in place certain policies to help people think about the way in which to approach those savings for retirement, I think that'll have a massive benefit. The problem, however, is a little bit greater than that, because in South Africa particularly, you're finding the issue of time management to be very large. So the youth, which in South Africa is about 77% of the population under the age of 35, they're really not considering that retirement savings is an issue for now. That's rather an issue for later. And that becomes a real problem because it turns out that 67% of them are not saving at all. So, coming back to the discussion we were having a little bit earlier, I think it needs to be a combination of some behavioral shifts in terms of putting in place the incentives to save, the tax incentives that the government is using is one good way of doing that. I think you need to couple that with an increase in financial education. I think it should be mandatory at least to have some savings in a provident fund or a preservation fund, as well as attending at least a short course every so often.
Cool. So let me throw a question to you then, Laurence, and it's my bugbear in the industry at the moment is that I believe that there are certain players within the industry who spend a lot of effort educating on education, but in general, are we spending enough as a broad financial services industry, it's banks, insurers, asset managers, on educating the market as a whole, or do you think we're just going and rehashing the same thing time and time again?
I think there's pockets. So there's a number of companies that are investing a huge amount of their CSI spend in educating, and they're doing a great job. They're teaming up with various government organisations. On the whole, I don't think so. No, we as companies aren't doing enough. But I would imagine over time that we would need to provide the level of literacy that consumers need to understand the products, but also to understand how it impacts their financial future.
Sorry, I'd just like to pop a question to Ryan. How much of a role are informal savings mechanisms like stokvels, how much of a role are they playing, and should we be focusing there more as well?
Absolutely, that's a huge issue in South Africa at the moment. The big problem with national statistics around savings and consumption expenditure is that it doesn't really measure anything to do with the informal sector. And that is really where much of the South African populace resides. So, if you're considering incentives for how to get people to save, particularly towards retirement, stokvels and those informal savings mechanisms are the most important. The problem is there's no real way to regulate that at the moment, because they do occur informally. They do occur, amongst communities that are generally managing them themselves. And so it can be a very difficult thing to regulate in terms of, fair practice and fair rates of return.
Very quickly, Mark, you had a question.
Yeah, my question was just going to be to Laurence to go and say, we talk about education. I know when I was in high school and primary school, financial education was non-existent. They've now had almost a decade where LO and what have you is educating you around money and handling your finances to some degree. Why is it not coming through into the work? Why is it not reflecting in the adult population yet?
I think the first place to start is you highlight is school. Government made an intention with Trevor Manuel 11 years ago that they needed to increase national saving to grow the economy. Minister Pravin Gordhan has said in the last 2 years that financial literacy is important. What we haven't seen is it flowing through from both government and from schooling systems and the infrastructure and from corporates through to the schools. There are pockets, as I said earlier, but it is definitely an area that needs to be addressed.